Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to this evening's event here at the auditorium and on your screens at home, as we're once again offering a live stream today. We have invited you to this event together with the Antigypsyism Research Center at Heidelberg University. And at the center of this is the opening of an online portal. The project is a large-scale online encyclopedia that brings together the scattered knowledge about the National Socialist genocide of the Sinti and Roma in Europe. We are very pleased to be able to offer a greeting to welcome Mr. Romani Rose. He is chairman of the Central Council of German Sinti and Roma and Managing Director of the Documentation and Culture Center of German Sinti and Roma in Heidelberg. We are also very pleased that Ambassador Dr. Robert Klinke will be with us. He has not arrived yet, but he's supposed to also address a word of welcome to us. He's special representative of the Federal Foreign Office for Relations with Jewish Organizations, Antisemitism issues, international affairs of the Sinti and Roma, and Holocaust Remembrance, Berlin. As a co-organizer and speaker, I would like to also warmly welcome Dr. Karola Fings from Heidelberg. As head of the international project, she will give us an insight into the online encyclopedia. She has had a long-standing research focus on the Nazi persecution of Sinti and Roma and numerous publications on this topic. Last but not least, I would also like to extend a warm welcome to Professor Dr. Michael Wildt and Dr. Jane Weiß. They were both members of the project Scientific Advisory Board and will then summarize some of their thoughts on the project in their comments. Until spring 2022, Mr. Wildt was professor of German history in the 20th century with a focus on National Socialism at Humboldt University of Berlin. Mrs. Weiß is a consultant for community-based historical political education at the Federal Agency for Civic Education and a private lecturer at the Humboldt University in Berlin. Ladies and gentlemen, the Documentation Center Topography of Terror has had deliberations with the Organization for Sinti and Roma in Heidelberg for a long time concerning an exhibition concerning the German period of National Socialism, and Gestapo, SS and Reichssicherheitshauptamt in Wilhelm and Prinz Albrecht Straße have had a central role to play in the persecution of the Sinti and Roma. The Gestapo was the responsible authority, but it was mainly the Kriminal- and Polizeiamt that was the Reichssicherheits- and Hauptamt, and it is central also in the persecution of Sinti and Roma under National Socialist rule. I think there is a photo of our permanent exhibition, and you can see it in this building. You may be wondering why the exhibition has not been shown here, but concerning the persecution of Sinti and Roma under National Socialist rule has been documented on more so than in the past. concerning the persecution of Sinti and Roma in Europe during the National Socialist rule, there are gaps that still need to be filled. For that reason, I'm very glad that Dr. Fings' project will be introduced here today, and I'm very curious to see the results. Concerning the organization of this event, I mentioned it already. After the keynote speeches, there will be Q&A sessions for those present, and if you are in the online audience, you will be able to address your questions via email, and the technical information will be available. And we also have simultaneous interpretation into English during this event. And last but not least, I would like to inform you that the cafeteria will be open until 10 p.m. so you can stay here and talk to the other guests. And I would now like to pass the floor to Mr. Romani Rose. Ambassador Klinke, Ms. Fings, Dr. Klinke. I would also like to welcome Jane Weiß and Dr. Michael Wildt. Ladies and gentlemen, it was on the 17th of March 1982 the then Federal Chancellor Helmut Schmidt declared, and I quote, "Sinti and Roma were severely wronged by the Nazi dictatorship. They were persecuted on racial grounds. Many of them were murdered. These crimes constituted genocide." This declaration was of great importance for Sinti and Roma in Germany as well as in Europe and internationally, because here, almost 40 years after the end of the Third Reich, the crime of genocide against the Sinti and Roma was recognized by the German government for the first time, and this in a declaration that was binding under international law. This legal and political recognition was questioned or disputed for years and decades to come. Even in the field of science, the denial of the genocide of the Sinti and Roma was also firmly established in state institutions after 1945. It was on racial grounds that Nazis persecuted Sinti and Roma. And I would like to inform you once more that 1/8, so if there was just 1/8 in the family history, they even tracked it down until the 16th century, and it was the competencies of the different authorities that overlapped, and the top representative for this persecution program was Mr. Himmler. This political recognition was denied for years and decades to come, even in the field of science. And after 1945, it was even the state institutions that still denied this. And the Encyclopaedia of the Genocide of the Sinti and Roma of Europe, presented here today, it's the first time, and I emphasize this, first time, despite the work that have been published on this subject in recent years, that the extent of these crimes has become apparent. It is within the framework of this project that hundreds and hundreds of crime scenes that have been identified, from shootings in Eastern Europe to concentration camps in Western Europe. And at the same time, this encyclopedia shows how backward research into the Holocaust of the Sinti and Roma in Europe still is. We would therefore like to thank the initiator of this project, Dr. Karola Fings, and the many employees she was able to recruit at European level. Special thanks also go to Ambassador Dr. Robert Klinke and the Federal Foreign Office, who secured the comprehensive funding for this project. If I use the term Holocaust to refer to the genocide crimes committed against the Sinti and Roma, it is because this term has an eminently political meaning. For decades, Sinti and Roma in Germany were excluded from any kind of reappraisal of this crime against humanity. And it took the support of many Jewish people, academics, and above all, Holocaust survivors to overcome this denial of the Holocaust against Sinti and Roma. Miriam Novic, Selma Steinmetz, Donald Kenrick, Simon Wiesenthal, Henry Friedlander, and many other names stand for this diverse support. Simone Weil said at the first European Memorial Rally in 1979 that Jews and Sinti and Roma, and I quote, have suffered together, that we have mourned together our dead who were burned in the crematorium, that the ashes of all our parents are united. Simone Weil also said, however, that she believed we did not always feel enough solidarity, the solidarity of shared misfortune. Since then, this solidarity has become ever stronger, and I would like to thank the chairman of the Central Council of Jews in Germany, Dr. Josef Schuster, for whom the joint commemoration of the victims of the Holocaust corresponds to the shared responsibility from the past for the present. The president of the World Jewish Congress in New York, Ronald Lauder, declared on the occasion of the commemoration of the European Holocaust Remembrance Day for Sinti and Roma on the 2nd of August 2020, and I quote, "They were murdered because they were Sinti and Roma, just like 6 million Jews who were murdered by the Nazis in the Shoah just because they were Jews. Almost 1 million of them in Auschwitz-Birkenau. Auschwitz was the zenith of all evil that anti-Semitism and anti-Ziganism can lead to." Our thanks also go to the European Parliament, which in April 2015 designated the 2nd of August the Roma Holocaust Remembrance Day and recommended that all member states designate this day as a national day of remembrance. On the 2nd of August 1944, the last 4,300 Sinti and Roma were murdered in Auschwitz-Birkenau in Camp Section B2E, the so-called Gypsy Camp, by the Nazis. Ladies and gentlemen, it is impossible to talk about the Holocaust, about the genocidal crimes of the Nazis, without talking about the heinous terrorist attack by Hamas on Israel, and also about Israel's massive response. In this context, the situation of the Palestinians in Gaza has been repeatedly compared to Nazi ghettos. We all know that the crime of genocide was introduced into international criminal law in response to the Nazi crimes against humanity. If Jewish students can be attacked at Freie Universität Berlin today, and the university does not see itself in a position to exmatriculate such offenders immediately, then there is no need for a firewall. There is already a fire in the parlor. And then the appropriate instruments of our constitutional state are needed to provide the appropriate response. Today, We have to listen to academic debates in which the Holocaust is explained as a mere continuation of colonial crimes from a post-colonial perspective. Such a debate dilutes the concepts of the Holocaust and the Nazi genocidal crimes. Such an approach, which instrumentalizes the Nazi Holocaust for political interests, not only devalues the historical experience, it also turns the victims of the Holocaust into a maneuvering mass and robs them of their dignity once again. We therefore need clarity about what the Nazi crimes against humanity mean for us. And in the context of an encyclopedia of the genocide of the Sinti and Roma, we need clarity about the dimension of the intended extermination of the Sinti and Roma in Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, today we are caught up in a situation in which more and more identitarian positions are emerging, formulated by both right-wing and left-wing politicians, and often enough brought to the media and the public by small but vocal groups, from the left, but even more so from the right. Identities, whether of groups or nations, are allegedly being positioned against the universalism of the Enlightenment. These identities, allegedly more important than universal human rights and the free will of the individual, the values of universalism and human rights, and consequently those of our democracy, are played off as colonial projects of a global north against a global south, and are often enough negated. It is precisely in this context that the civilizational rupture of the Holocaust is now being relativized. The point here cannot be that our memory of the abyss of the Holocaust could obscure the crimes of colonial history. It cannot be about pitting groups of victims against each other or asserting a hierarchy of victims. The aim must be to anchor human rights universally. And once again, let me repeat that it's not about asserting a hierarchy of victims. The aim must be to anchor human rights universally, and the experience of the Third Reich is a permanent obligation for us. The encyclopedia presented today provides precisely the necessary standards for this. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Riedler just told me that it's my turn, so yes, so I shall take the floor. Thank you, Mrs. Dr. Riedler, Mr. Rose, Mrs. Fings, dear Dr. Weiß, dear Professor Wildt. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank you cordially, Mrs. Rings, and everybody involved for the initiation and the realization of this important project, which was brought to life in 2020, and it seriously is a privilege and a joy to see this work and how it evolved. In the feuilletons, we may read about urgency to speak about this work. I prefer not to use such vocabulary. Instead, it is my firm conviction that with the intensive work that went into this encyclopedia, which is now being made accessible, provides a basis that we have missed for so long, that academic research and the understanding of National Socialist genocide of Sinti and Roma may come and lead out of the marginalization, and not only create a foundation, but also make it something useful for the general public, such as me. For the Federal Foreign Office, it was a joy to support this important project. Dear ladies and gentlemen, the Nazi crimes against humanity are, no matter how you deal with it, unbelievable incisions in Germany's history, in Europe's, and indeed in the worldwide history. The wounds lay deep and are still tangible. Taking these wounds into account, the last 8 decades seem to be only a short moment for those affected. However, this is an eternity. We cannot and we must not forget, because it is about remembrance, it is about commemoration and knowledge. Developing a remembrance culture of the genocide of the Sinti and Roma started at a very late stage. After the Second World War, a continued marginalization that lasted for decades had a difficult impact on the understanding of the systematic murder of Sinti and Romas. Sonny Weiß, a survivor, described this in 2011 in his speech at the German Bundestag in the remembrance commemoration of the victims. And there were reports, however, they weren't heard. Only in the 1980s, thanks to the civil rights movements of the Sinti and Roma, the attention grew for this marginalization. Otto Rosenberg, Anna Mettbach, Hugo and Manu Höllenreiner, Walter Winter, Gerda Pohl, Christian Pfeil, and Sonny Weiß shared their thoughts not only in Germany but also in Europe and on an international level. Christian Pfeil bore witness, and he had been to the United Nations for the International Holocaust Memorial Day. He was a guest there and reminded us of the victims of the forgotten Holocaust, and also stood up to make the August 2nd an international commemoration day for the Nazi genocide of the Sinti and Roma. Ladies and gentlemen, also the path to getting to commemoration took a long time. Hundreds of thousands Sinti and Roma became victims of the National Socialist genocide. It took 4 decades before Helmut Schmidt, our former Chancellor, Mr. Rose reminded us of this, in 1982 acknowledged the genocide. It took 5 decades before the decision was made to build a memorial for the victims of the National Socialist genocide. Only 1992 did the federal government decide to create such a memorial. Before this was the tireless efforts of the civil rights movement. And it was only in 2012, after 2 decades, 2 further decades, until the memorial was, I will say, finally unveiled in the Berlin Tiergarten. This was 1 year after Sonny Weiss's speech before the German Bundestag. He was the first survivor of the National Socialist genocide of the Sinti and Roma who spoke in the German parliament. More than 7 decades is how long it took. Mr. Rose, you just mentioned this, that the European Parliament in 2015 accepted a declaration in which the genocide was accepted. As a European commemorative day, August the 2nd was selected, the European Holocaust Remembrance Day for the Sinti and Roma. The remembrance still is underrepresented in the public. Ladies and gentlemen, the knowledge of this genocide of the Sinti and Roma was hardly researched. But more than 8 decades after this terrible crime, the knowledge gaps are now being filled. However, it is not only about knowledge, understanding what has happened, bringing learnings together. Precise knowledge of what has happened is important for a number of reasons, out of respect for the victims, for these survivors, their descendants, to maintain their knowledge, their memories, to honor it, and also to maintain their remembrance, and to understand the unbelievable dimension, at least to try to understand what has happened, so as to develop a possibility to take action for our democracy, for human rights, for the rule of law, to counteract developments that will endanger our open democratic societies. Maintaining the memories and comprehending these crimes not only enables an adequate way to deal with the past, but it goes much further. It strengthens us as a society as a whole, on a national level, European level, as well as internationally. By strengthening the awareness for what has happened, the awareness for what is strengthened for our current developments. And only in this way will we be made possible to counteract discrimination and marginalization. The Encyclopaedia, Dr. Fings and dear colleagues, that will be presented today provides a valuable asset. It doesn't only summarize systematically what has been learned and fills knowledge gaps, and is not only made available for academics as well as for the public. Dr. Fings, Dr. Weiß, and Professor Wildt, as well as the team, have developed a European-wide network during their work, which have contributed to the work. In September, in Zagreb, I was actually allowed to participate, to experience what is happening. And this is unique. It is a milestone in understanding the crimes. The online encyclopedia being launched today is a meaningful starting point for the understanding and processing what has happened to the communities of the Sinti and Roma, and it is an important foundation to create a joint culture of remembrance. The pain cannot be made undone. It cannot heal the wounds, but it can create a basis for understanding and for joint action. Thank you very much.
Ja, sehr, sehr schön, was ich hier alles gehört habe.
Well, I heard great remarks, Ms. Riedler, Mr. Rose, Mr. Klinke, Michael, Jane, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased that the Encyclopedia of the Nazi genocide of the Sinti and Roma in Europe is going online today. I would like to thank you, Ms. Riedler, for the uncomplicated cooperation with you and your employees. And I'm really delighted that we're able to be guests here at this location. This encyclopedia is a very, very large building project. It was planned for a long time and it was built piece by piece. I would like to start by telling you how this happened and who was and is involved. I always felt that the memorial for the Sinti and Roma of Europe murdered under National Socialism, which was unveiled in Berlin in 2012, should be given a greater historical foundation. That's why I wrote, as early as in 2014, an initial concept for an encyclopedia. Uwe Neumerker and Jana Mechelhoff-Herezi, she's here, I know, from the Foundation Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe, and Frank Reuter, who was still working at the Documentation and Cultural Center of German Sinti and Roma at that time, were the first people I discussed this idea with. But the time was not yet ripe. I then organized an international project from 2015 to 2019 as part of ROM Archive, the digital archive of the arts and cultures of Sinti and Roma. Voices of the Victims, it's the name of the section I curated, in which testimonies from the perspective of Sinti and Roma from the time of persecution or immediately afterwards are presented for 20 countries. In the course of this work, an international network of scholars gradually emerged, which I felt was also viable for an encyclopedia. Then everything happened relatively quickly. I approached you, Mr. Rose, and at the launch of a ROM archive, and you were immediately enthusiastic about it. I met with Ambassador Michaela Küchler, your predecessor, Mr. Klinke, and she promised me her support for this 5-year project. The fact that the Federal Foreign Office is funding the encyclopedia and that you, Mr. Klinke, and the staff in your department are always supportive and helpful to me, and the project is an absolute stroke of luck. Well, the funding for this large building project was now secured, but more people were needed to pour the foundations. I found cooperation partners to support the project in various ways. In addition to the Memorial Foundation and the Documentation Center, these include the Federal Agency for Civic Education, the Documentation Center of Austrian Resistance in Vienna, and the Fritz Bauer Institute in Frankfurt am Main. They're all actively involved in researching and or communicating the history and I would like to thank all of them for their supportive partnership. The encyclopedia is a scientific endeavor, so it was important to me from the outset to have a strong advisory board that could contribute both critically and constructively. I discussed the encyclopedia with you, dear Michael, at a very early stage. We met in the cafe of the German Historical Museum. We also scribbled down a few names of potential advisory board members on a beer mat, and I have to say that this was really groundbreaking. In addition to you and Jane, and the advisory board includes Susanne Heim, Berlin, Dieter Pohl, Klagenfurt, Tanja Penter, Heidelberg, Sibylle Steinbacher, Frankfurt, Nikolaus Waxman, London, and Jens Christian Wagner from Weimar. We've met 6 times since 2020 for working sessions lasting several hours, which have always provided important impetus for the work on the encyclopedia. I'm very grateful for this. I established the encyclopedia's construction office at the Research Center on Antigypsyism at Heidelberg University. Founded in 2017, the Research Center is the first and so far only university-based specialist institution that deals with fundamental studies on the causes, forms, and consequences of anti-Ziganism from the Middle Ages to the present day. The exchange with you, dear Frank, as the academic director of the Research Center, and the colleagues who are researching the National Socialist persecution of Sinti and Roma and its aftermath, is always a pleasure and very enriching. I started at the Research Center in July 2020 and initially did a lot of planning and communication. Sarah Kleinmann joined as a research assistant in 2021. Nils Lützen and Diana Patel joined the team as student assistants in 2022. And Martin Holler joined in 2023. We are a very small team for such a large building project, but thanks to your great commitment, we've been able to achieve a great deal, and I thank you very much for that.
I would say that the biggest challenge when working on the encyclopedia was to get proper construction documents from the rough initial sketches for the large building. And this is where two important players come into play. Firstly, the sixth cooperation partner, the Center for Digital Systems, CIDIS, at Freie Universität Berlin. Britte Grote and her team developed the open source software Open Encyclopedia System between 2016 and 2022. I came across it when I was looking for a technical solution for the online encyclopedia. Since 2021, CIDIS has been responsible for developing the data model, carrying out the technical implementation, and realizing the website based on designs by communication designer Rudi Bauer. Dear Brigitte, thanks to you and your team, we were able to design a proper architecture for the building in the first place, and that is invaluable. Thank you very much for your years of competent, patient, and dedicated support. My heartfelt thanks also go to Rudi Bauer, who developed the concise word mark for the project back in 2020, and whose clear and straightforward design puts the content of the encyclopedia center stage. Now, the second actor that is indispensable for the planning of the large building is the international network of authors that has been established in 2020. The aim of the encyclopedia is to collect and process existing knowledge about the Nazi genocide of the Sinti and Roma, to make it available in clearly organized form for the whole of Europe. Based on today's map of Europe, there are 46 countries to be covered. If we subtract those about which nothing is known, there are still 33. In order to cover this enormous range, Sarah Kleinman and I established no fewer than 18 working groups with researchers who met and continue to meet at regular intervals to discuss the topics to be worked on and to agree on the text to be written. Setting up these work groups was a lengthy process. It must be emphasized that research on the genocide of the Sinti and Roma and the Sintis and Romnia is still a very marginal field of research, and that there are no academic positions for this in any country. The colleagues who have researched and published on the genocide are usually unable to write the text for the encyclopedia while working full-time, but do so after work or on holiday, which is why we would like to take this opportunity to thank the authors involved for their great commitment. And yes, some are actually present in this room here. And I hope that many are also attending online. Today is the topping out ceremony for this large encyclopedia building. We have built the foundations and, together with CIDIS and the authors, designed the size of the building. We have built the masonry, installed the floors, and almost finished painting the facade, I would say. We drew floor plans of rooms and discussed with the authors how many rooms of what size they needed in the building. We created the staircases, corridors, and passageways, have laid cables and pipes. We have now created the conditions for the rooms to be occupied. The encyclopedia, which is available in German and English, is expected to contain 1,000 lemmata, or lemmas, as the keywords in the reference work are called. Currently, more than 90 authors are working on the texts. It really is the topping out ceremony. Yes, not everybody can move in yet, but what you will find and how is what I would like to show you now. Under A to Z, I'm going through the marks at the top here. The lemmas can be called up alphabetically. Behind the terms shown in black, you will already find content, which means that these quote-unquote rooms are already occupied. To quickly find out what is already available in the encyclopedia, you should click the point News in the menu. The focal points that we have set for the launch are explained here. Estonia represents a country in which almost all Roma and Romnia living there were murdered by a firing squad under German occupation. Deportations took place from occupied Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg to Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration and extermination camp. But persecution in fascist Italy has also been analyzed. I'm going to show you more in a minute. Another focus is the detention camps that were created specifically for Sinti and Roma. The United Kingdom represents a country that fought against Nazi Germany, and Switzerland, a neutral country, are also represented. You can also find the editorial via that selection menu at the top right. This explains the concept of the encyclopedia and its key principles. These include a racism critical approach to the existing body of knowledge, which is indispensable due to centuries of anti-Zionism and the long-lasting dominance of the perpetrators' narratives. We are constantly grappling with racist concepts and racist knowledge, and I would like to thank Jane Weiß, Miriam Karoli, and Stefan Lederich for, as critical friends, discussing such issues with us. Here, I will use the example of the United Kingdom to show you how the lemmas look and are structures. I chose this example for two reasons. Firstly, the article has very high news value because the author shows that the Allies already had very concrete knowledge of the genocide at an early stage. For example, in March 1943, a newspaper reported on the murders in German-occupied Serbia and the independent state of Croatia, as well as on forced sterilizations, executions, and forced labor, and on the camps in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia in Austria in March 43. But these reports did not resonate. The other reason is that I would like to take this opportunity to thank Eve Rosenheft. She was not only involved as an author, but also edits the English language texts of the encyclopedia and makes a significant contribution to the quality. And if you see a text with clumsy English, it's because it hasn't yet crossed Eve's desk. I must admit, every now and then I smuggle things past you, Eve, to get them finished. Each lemma is provided with an annotation. So here's where the literature is listed. Now, of course, this is important for further academic research. And also the literature is shown here. And what's especially important for finding the content is careful indexing. And here I would like to thank Jutta Mühlenberg, who is also here, who supports us with the proofreading of the German language text and the indexing. The lemmas can be searched not only from A to Z, but also according to 6 themes or rubrics. These rubrics refer to central topics in connection with the genocide of the Sinti and Roma and indicate the main focus of the encyclopedia. Here you can see the first 3 rubrics, themes. First is spaces, countries, regions, places. Next, a very important focus of the encyclopedia which is the crime scenes, internments, camps, ghettos, murder sites, and also life paths, biographies of Sinti and Roma. And here are the others. That is, first of all, the persecution system. The topics deal with institutions, persons, concepts, and laws. And of course, we have one area dealing with the aftermath, justice, compensation, commemoration. And then there's another rubric, which is something of a glossary, where terms and other things are explained. You can see this at the moment by selecting the Life Path section. There will be an estimated 150 biographies of Sinti and Roma in order to show the individuality of those affected by persecution, but also the resistance efforts and the after effects that the years before 1945 had and still have on them and their descendants. Another way to access the content of the encyclopedia is the chronology. All events from the various countries are summarized here. Due to the thematic focus of the encyclopedia, the chronology does not begin until 1933, even though we are aware that there is a long prehistory. This is usually told in the lemata themselves, however. However, the aftermath after 1945 is deliberately presented because this serious and current chapter must not be ignored. Only the absolutely necessary general historic data, such as the appointment of Adolf Hitler as Reich Chancellor, are included to provide a framework of sorts. The vast majority of the data relates to events connected with the persecution of Sinti and Roma. Here we read about the Norwegian Roma and Roma who were in 1934 turned back at the German-Danish border and 10 years later were among those deported from Mechelen to Auschwitz. Here you can also read, and I know this is small print and you're far away, that Bernhard Pabst was registered in the Dachau concentration camp on 16th May 1934. He's the first known Sinto known by name to be incarcerated in Dachau. The chronology opens up a pan-European perspective. With each new event, the picture becomes clearer. And as I said, we are generating this data from the lemma that already exist. I have to take my microphone with me. So this is May 7th. About 800 women, men, and children are registered in Auschwitz-Birkenau. May 10th for Roma team from the gypsy camp in the Protectorate Bohemia and Moravia. Borislav Dudi is shot. Lajek Dudi is then brought into Auschwitz. He survives. Ludwig Morka is later executed in Prague. Antonin Morka joins the resistance group. He survives. 11th June, 31 Roma and Sinti in the internalized try to escape. 13 adults and children are captured and brought back. July 1st in the Netherlands, the Germans prevent people from moving out if they live in camps. And maybe one more thing, July 1943, 637 mixed race people or gypsies are expelled into France. So these are little spotlights of our first few rooms. Each event can be clicked on. The lemma in which the event plays a role is then displayed. We take great care, as I already demonstrated, to include names wherever possible. Here, the names of the 5 young Roma who attempted to escape from a camp in German-occupied Estonia in 1942. The indices, meaning the words on places, people, and keywords, provide further access to the content. So we're taking great care to mention every small place and to include every person that is mentioned. Our principle is that no single piece of information shall be forgotten, always in the hopes that this knowledge domain is online, and then maybe somebody comes across it and can provide us with even more information. An overview of the authors can also be selected, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank all authors who have submitted their text and encourage everybody else to send them as soon as they can so that we can also share their knowledge with everyone. But I would also like to emphasize that the last few years have demanded a lot from everyone. We started working together at a time when the pandemic was just taking hold. And that was 2 long years, and of course that made things more difficult. And I would also like to remember that one of our authors, Mikhail Tjakli, had been a soldier on the front line for almost 2 years, defending the freedom of his Ukrainian homeland.
Hier habe ich
Here I have selected an author, and then I received brief information about him and a list of the texts he has written. I'm very grateful to Anton Weiß for sending us all the texts very early on. He's a colleague from Norway, by the way. And we were able to use these examples to develop the data model very well. Our thanks go to Norway. Just need to check my notes. Just a moment. A curatorial concept for the presentation of photographs was developed for the Encyclopaedia. And due to time constraints, I cannot go into this in more detail now, but you can also read about it in the editorial. It is important that we are aware of the power of photographs, and that photographs taken from the perspective of the perpetrators degrade the people depicted, and they conceal the power and violence that was dominant then. The idea of this photo section, called Photographic Perspectives on the Genocide, is to provide further access to the content of the encyclopedia and to understand these photographs as sources that have additional informational value. All photographs are provided with detailed captions that already contain information which can be explored in greater depth via the links. Here you can see the survivor, artist and writer Chaya Stoika. She will be represented in the encyclopedia with her story. I'm also showing her photo for a reason. It was Chaya Stoika's artwork that inspired the color scheme of this website. In the lemmas, the photographs are only displayed with a button, and this, if they belong to the context described, we wanted to give some context, and here you can see a button on the Dachau concentration camp. So it is very discreet, and it is only the deliberate selection that shows the photos, and always with dedicated information, additional information. Well, creating new knowledge and linking it up with familiar images is the topic of this example. You can see the well-known scene of the hunger strike in Dachau in April 1980, which was of great importance for the international perception of the genocide, which had not been recognized until then, so it had a very big importance. 4 survivors were present. One of them was Hans Braun. You can see him in the middle. So far, his story has not been told anywhere. The authors Jérôme Courtois and Daniel Tillmann from Luxembourg have now compiled some information for the encyclopedia. Hans Braun had 10 siblings. With the exception of one sister, they were murdered along with their parents. He himself fled from the threat of arrest or from prison 7 times. He was able to go into hiding in Luxembourg for quite some time, thanks to the help of a network that existed there, organized by the Sinti, until he was arrested and deported from Luxembourg to Auschwitz-Birkenau with his 2 cousins. I think you see this photo with different eyes if you know the underlying story. I would now like to turn to another important part of the encyclopedia, the maps. Here you can see a dynamic map on which all the crime scenes that we find out about are brought together, and this map is growing all the time. You can zoom into this map, and there are different color schemes like places of massacres, concentration and extermination camps, and other places of detention. And as I said, they're differentiated by color, and you can select an item, then you will find the name of the crime scene. It's displayed together with a link to the respective lemma, so you can directly gain access to the relevant piece of information. Beyond that, there are thematic maps that have been especially produced for the encyclopedia. Here, I would like to thank the, well, I don't know if he's here, the cartographer Peter Palm. Oh, he's here. I can see him. Great. Hi. So this is the cartographer Peter Palm, who produced these maps with great meticulousness. And it's a great piece of work, and I would like to introduce some examples, because the visualization using maps gives us another level of information on the extent of crime. Each map has a specific focus. You can see the overview of forced labor camps in the German Reich. And so far, no visualization like that has existed. And I think in the course of this work, this will certainly change so that more information will be available on different camps. And Mr. Palm, I think you are patient enough to update these maps from time to time. Just let me check my notes. Well, I can't find them, so I will give you some spontaneous comments. This is a map where we invested a great deal of work. The lemmas on Italy from our Italian colleague Paola Trevisan. She may be part of the online community. Well, and you can click into or onto that map. And the whole situation in Italy is so complex and difficult to oversee, where the Sinti and Roma were sometimes well detained in communities in concentration camps, but they were also part of prisons, prison colonies, and they were also expelled to islands like Sardinia, for example. And I think this visualization really supports the general understanding of the entire persecution process. Well, and this directly leads us to the respective lemma, and here you can see the principle of chronology again. We have the general chronology, but on each lemma we have the events that specifically fit a given event. This is a map that required a great deal of work. Let me show it in the context of the maps and the encyclopedia. Once again, let me thank my colleagues Diana and Niels, who really spent weeks on the research on what places were affected at all. And concerning the persecution and murder of Roma and Sinti in then Poland, there's hardly any research, but there is one map from 1980 based on the historian's work of Piotr Kasia. And well, it was difficult to find the right spelling of the places and to find the right location. And now, by and by, the respective information on those places will then be published. and I think there are 167 places, and there were shootings in several of them, 4,500 victims in these shootings alone. And I think this is an important starting point. So all those location names are now, they have a geo-reference and they are in the index. So it is for the first time now that these crime scenes will be visible and visualized, which is part and parcel of our work. And then the search function, well, you can always have a full text search across the context and across the lemmas. So for example, you can enter the search term Estonia, and at the moment the information will be available only in one language, but there will be translation work on an ongoing basis. For Estonia, it will be available in English at the moment. And here you can see which lemmas have been created on the context, and then you can go into the content. And specifically for Estonia, the chronology will be shown, and then you can go on scrolling. This is a search function where I only enter the word Auschwitz, and this word occurs many times. And here you may be able to see what a variety of topics is covered in the encyclopedia, which will then be accessible via the different search paths. That concludes my presentation. So I wanted to go live now and read out from the editorial. If it's not possible, I would like to ask my colleague to come to the fore. Well, I think we're live online now. It doesn't look a lot different from what you've seen before, but now you can see the link, which is a benefit, of course, and now it's live. Oh. So let me go to the editorial. Thanks to Maren, it's up and running. Thanks to everyone in CEDIS. And now let me read out the last paragraph, and that will conclude my introductory words. The Encyclopedia of the Nazi Genocide of the Sinti and Roma in Europe is a work of collective knowledge that constantly seeks to critically supplement, expand, and deepen that very collective knowledge. It aims to stimulate new research and the sources of which should in turn inform discourses and practices of remembrance, giving them firmer and deeper foundations. The encyclopedia aims to reach a broad public in order to anchor knowledge about the genocide more firmly in society. A further aim is to confront Antigypsyism, which has continued unabated since 1945, and thus contribute to overcoming it. Finally, the encyclopedia is a symbol for the recognition of the genocide committed against Sinti and Roma, which is important and necessary not only, but especially for the victims and their descendants. If we achieve any of this with our work, it will have been worthwhile.
Ja, Frau Fings, ich bin wahnsinnig beeindruckt.
I'm very impressed indeed of this encyclopedia. This really involves a lot of work. It is incredibly detailed, but it is also the revisiting of maps and all the details. This is so impressive, and I very much look forward to our panel discussion. But before that, there will be two comments of the members of the Scientific Advisory Board. So I think we should turn to the comments, and now it is up to Professor Dr. Michael Wildt to give the first one.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to say a few words that I managed to contribute to a little degree. Roma and Sinti were a persecuted group in Europe before 1933 and after 45. And as we heard, it took until the 1980s for initiatives to recognize the persecution of Sinti and Romania by the Nazis to take effect in the Federal Republic of Germany. Well, compensation for persecuted Jewish people were agreed between Israel and the Federal Republic of Germany in 1952. In the Luxembourg Agreement, the German citizens who suffered in concentration camp imprisonment received financial recognition for the violence inflicted on them in the Federal Compensation Act of September 1953. This did not, however, apply to Roma and Sinti. In 1956, the Federal Court of Justice ruled that Roma and Sinti should only receive compensation for the period after Heinrich Himmler's decree of December 16, 1942, in which he ordered the deportation of Roma and Sinti, in his words, gypsies, to a concentration camp. And as we just heard, there was a separate camp section set up for Roma and Sinti in Auschwitz, whose last prisoners, men, women, and children, were murdered in the gas chambers on the night of August 2nd and 3rd, 1944. Until 1943, according to the Federal Court of Justice in its 1956 ruling, the persecution was based on the quote-unquote asocial characteristics of gypsies and not on racism. It was not until 1963 that the Federal Court of Justice corrected this and conceded that Sinti and Roma had already been persecuted on racial grounds from 1938 onwards. By then, it was already too late for many of those persecuted to receive compensation. Discriminatory and stigmatizing practices on the part of the police continued even after 1945, and indeed continue to this day. The Federal Criminal Police Office, for example, continued the so-called Gypsy Card Index from the Nazi era without interruption, only thinly disguised with other designations, until the Social Liberal Coalition under Willy Brandt put an end to these activities. I mean, we heard it ourselves. It was the victims' associations themselves, the Association of Racially Persecuted Non-Jews, founded by brothers Oscar and Vinzenz Rose, and then the Association of German Sinti and Roma, founded by Romani Rose, which, together with local initiatives and memorials, drew public attention to the lack of recognition of the persecution. In 1979, the first rally was held at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp memorial. We saw this in the impressive photo at Easter 1980, where young Sinti went on a week-long hunger strike at the Dachau concentration camp memorial to draw attention to the lack of public recognition of the persecution and the ongoing discrimination. Only then, and Mr. Rose mentioned this in detail, was there a clear word from the former Federal Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, who publicly declared that it had been racist persecution should be regarded as genocide. And then the decision in 1992 by the Bundestag, finally inaugurating the memorial in 2012. The discrimination and stigmatization of Roma and Sinti in Europe still continues to this day, in Romania, in France, and also here in Germany. And I think it has to be said clearly that if, as a consequence of the genocide of the European Jews, the German federal government declares it as a matter of state to guarantee the security of Israel and the Jews in Germany, then it must also ensure that, as a consequence of the genocide of Roma and Sinti, they are protected from discrimination and persecution. Just as it took a long time for the persecution of Roma and Sinti to be recognized by society, it also took a long time for academic studies on the history of persecution to finally get underway, even though, and this should be explicitly stated here, the Documentation and Cultural Center of German Sinti and Roma in Heidelberg does extraordinary work. Without the holdings of and the commitment of the center, research would have lagged far behind. In this respect, the website that is being presented today is a groundbreaking achievement because it finally makes the current knowledge that we have on this history, culture, and also on the persecution of Roma and Sinti in Europe publicly available. And in the form of an online encyclopedia, has found an excellent way of continuously expanding and updating this knowledge. As we just saw, the first lemma always designated with 10 to update them to 20 to update with new knowledge. Nevertheless, there is still a lot to do. If you look at the country analyses on the website, then you will see that there is already a research basis for some countries, but that fundamental research is still lacking for other countries, especially in Eastern Europe. The encyclopedia's principle for working with country teams seems to be an excellent approach for me to drive forward research on the ground. We hardly know anything about the murder sites in the occupied territories in Eastern Europe where Roma and Sinti were shot. And we are dependent on the reports of the survivors and their families to identify the people who were murdered by the SS Einsatzkommandos and their helpers, and to preserve their names. The maps, and especially the photos that we see, are a testament to the quality of the website, because photos seem to be very evident, but the thing is that photos always have to be put into context, especially persecution photos from the NS time and from the Holocaust. And that this is happening so diligently is the special quality of this encyclopedia. There is now research on perpetrators such as Robert Ritter and Eva Justin, even if it is a scandal that somebody like Eva Justin today is still cited in literature today with her doctorate, even though she earned it in 1943 with a racist anti-Zionistic thesis at Berlin University. Not only the University of Berlin, but other universities should make it clear that this is about racism and not about science. And not only for the Nazi era, there needs to be research, but also the post-war period, as the continuity of discrimination stigmatization is obvious. Often the same police officers were still responsible who were responsible for the persecution before 45 were still in their posts and continued to act against Roma and Sinti after 45. Last but not least, or should I say above all, we should be interested in social anti-Gypsyism, the hostile images and resentments against Roma and Sinti that still exist and have a powerful impact. If you read the 2021 report of the Independent Commission of Antigypsyism to the Federal Republic, which was recently debated in the Bundestag, it is something that I would like to recommend to you all. And then you will find a wealth of examples of exclusion, disadvantage, and discrimination in the everyday lives of Roma and Sinti. The history and culture of Roma and Sinti in Europe, it is nothing separate alien and to be excluded, but it is part of society. This is why an encyclopedia that provides information about the culture and history of Roma and Sinti in Europe is also always a piece of the history of interdependence with the respective majority societies, which are by no means homogeneous, but are characterized by a multitude of cultures. The Encyclopedia on the Persecution of Roma and Sinti in Europe is not a minority history that we can look at from the outside, so to say, but it is also our history. Thank you very much.
Chaya Stoica
was asked why, as a survivor, she kept coming back to Auschwitz and replied, "I've made it my mission. As long as I'm alive and have something to say, as long as I still can, I will do it so that evil has no chance. And young people must help to ensure that this does not happen again, so that Auschwitz remains a memorial that you can really only enter with very light feet and where you have to watch your step, because on every stone and on every leaf and on every grass lies the dust of our dead. One should walk like G's, one behind the other, carefully and with devotion and caution. This is a memorial that remains forever, a memorial, and that it will not come to life again because the foundation stone has been laid. The Encyclopedia of the Nazi Genocide of the Sinti and Roma in Europe stands on many shoulders, on those of the people who persistently write, excavate, and make this history accessible, but above all, on the many shoulders of the personalities from our communities who have fought for us to be able to stand here today. Without the courage, confidence, and will of the survivors and their families to continue living in the land of the perpetrators, a society that for the most part denied the atrocities, the suffering, the torture, and the murders, and rejected all responsibility, this encyclopedia would not exist. We owe it to the tenacity, trust, and survival of Chaya Stoica, Otto Rosenberg, Elisabeth Gutenberger, Hildegard Lagren, Vincent Rose, Sevedin Yunus, and many other people who took responsibility among themselves. The responsibility for ensuring that there would be a better, fairer future for our people, for us, our descendants, their children and grandchildren, and therefore, ultimately, for everyone. We have to find a way for ourselves. We must find a way for us. Lass Maro Chachifen. Let's claim our rights, sings Weiß, and thus created the soundtrack of the civil rights movement of Sinti and Roma in the Federal Republic of Germany, which had to fight for rights, step by step, on the shoulders of the survivors, and more supported by the second generation, because nothing, but nothing at all, was conceded to them. On the contrary, there was an immediate social headwind of defamation, disparagement, denial of belonging, and even criminalization of individual personalities and the movement as a whole. Romani Rose and his companions can bear eloquent witness to this. Likewise, Melanie Spitter, Ilona and Reinhold Lagren, Otto, Petra, and Markus Rosenberg, Fatima Hartmann, and so many others. They have sought and found a way, paved the way for us, preserved and passed on their knowledge, fought for recognition and justice. And they did so in a social mood, a basic atmosphere, and now come the sober facts, that was characterized by hostility, racism, and defensiveness even after 1945, After 1945, there was initially neither symbolic recognition of the genocide nor adequate material compensation for the victims. The perpetrators were not held accountable either. Instead, they exonerated each other. They were also able to continue to actively harm the victims and their families in compensation processes, for example. The perpetrators' tactic of shifting blame was particularly painful for the victims. They were criminalized and their credibility undermined. These attributions shaped the dominant social convictions and were the consensus in institutions and large sections of society for decades. The UKA report rightly describes it as a hermetic cartel of silence and exoneration at the center of the state apparatus, against which the surviving Sinti and Roma had no chance. The reversal and denial of guilt, the denial of the genocide, the humiliation and defamation of survivors, and the unbroken racism against Sinti and Roma updated a social climate of exclusion that also has significance for subsequent generations. And three important steps are briefly mentioned here. The denial of German citizenship. It is one of the most scandalous practices of West German politics that a significantly high number of survivors who had been in position to German citizenship before the Nazi persecution was denied the status after 1945. The deprivation of citizenship also automatically applied to their children, so that the discrimination continued in the following generations. Second, economic and residential marginalization. After 1945, very few families were able to return to their lives before the persecution and re-establish themselves in their old homes with their former businesses. Many were forced to settle in the form of forced labor camps or in other temporary accommodation. As a result, many people were pushed to the outskirts of the cities in the 1950s into slums. Third, the continuation of the racist special registration. The racist special registration of Sinti and Roma had formed the organizational backbone of Nazi persecution. The special registration was continued without interruption after 1945. It was continued by many of the former experts from the SS and police apparatus and with the Nazi files. It did not even stop at the survivors and registered them under the tattooed Auschwitz number. We must therefore bear in mind that these people suffered years of persecution, expulsion, torture, and murder. After 1945, they returned to a country that did not recognize the suffering, but rather attributed it to the victims themselves, criminalized them, and continued to register them with the authorities, actively denying them compensation and fundamental civil rights. Many were severely traumatized, but tirelessly rebuilt their lives under these conditions of injustice. The second generation grew up under these conditions and also had to cope with two tasks at once, caring for the survivors and shaping their own future. This is why the Commission is also calling for this generation to be compensated in the spirit of restorative justice. I'm having a particular German focus, although there is an international dimension to it. At the moment, we know too little about the extent of the atrocities in different countries, countries that were victims of Nazi occupation. And this encyclopedia will change that, and it will make sure that these victims and their families will be included in our mourning and our rage and the efforts to restore justice. The survivors are the exception is the title of a chapter in Anna Abuzuzi's book, Our Father, a Sinti family tells its story. The few survivors have endured the unimaginable, the unspeakable, and have yet not given up confidence and hope, but have lived them. The survival and continuation of life is linked to visions for a future in which silence, concealment, and denial are no options. a future in which the veto right of the sources, as the historical theorist Koselleck calls it, also applies to the survivors and their testimony. The Encyclopaedia transforms embodied knowledge into visibility, accessibility, makes it tangible, and with all the caution that must be applied to this term, also true. True in a recognized, socially legitimized sense, because for the people and their families, this knowledge has always been true, regardless of what was recognized socio-politically, because, as Isidora Rancelovic so aptly puts it, a public hegemonic unremembering is by no means synonymous with collective forgetting in Sinti and Roma communities. And now I come back to the beginning, in conclusion. Saya Stoica sums up the physical inscription of her painful experience with the following words: "It never goes out. I breathe it in and out. I live with it." Thank you.
Ja, vielen Dank an Herrn Wildt.
Mr. Wildt, Mrs. Weiß, thank you very much for having built the bridge from 1945 to the present, and that you've spoken about the continued discrimination and also the long journey to recognition and what it means for those affected and for their descendants. I am sure that you are very impatient and would like to ask your questions. So let me start with two questions, and then it is your turn. I'd like to ask Mrs. Fings. I mean, this is a gargantuan project. You said that we are speaking about a project that focuses on 46 countries. However, you only know more on 33 of these countries. So please let me know what the situation regarding the sources is and how they are different. So how do things look with evidence of people affected themselves, photo material by the victims, by the perpetrators? Are we still online? Witnesses and perpetrators, and how things differ between the European countries. You can select the countries here, just the countries. Here you go. So it's 49 countries. And some are already listed here. Now we have a few more in the English section, I assume. And to be honest, the encyclopedia started with the pragmatic approach that we will summarize the knowledge that we have. We can't go into the archives and do research there with a few people that we have, which is why we need this network of authors who have already done this on site. And there are different levels of research. I have a very active colleague, Daniel Wojek, who goes into the archives for a very long time in Croatia. So he has acquired this knowledge and is processing it. And then there are other countries, unfortunately, and it had to be Poland, which of course was a central site of crimes where hardly any research has been done. So it would be presumptuous to say that we can compensate for these gaps. We cannot meet this claim or demand, so that would be a task which cannot be solved. And that's not necessarily my style, which is why we will approach the topic very pragmatically. If we only have indications or if only certain areas have been researched on. And we will present this, at least in a way that is accessible internationally, in the hope that we can trigger further research And I think that's the special thing about this encyclopedia, that we have the opportunity to, first of all, collect little mosaic stones, individual lemmata, camps, sites, to take down this information, fully well knowing that we still do not know much more, but then to build it piece by piece. Okay, thank you very much. Now, this reminds me of a different approach. This is the Edition Project Jewish Prosecution, is the Institute for Contemporary History. And maybe this project will also motivate to do further research, because information is collected. And this nicely ties in with my next question regarding the persecution of Sinti and Roma and how this all went about. Now, we know from the German Reich that everything was very bureaucratic, with the collection of the data, the names, and with deportation plans. And I think that was also executed in this way in the Netherlands and Belgium. Now, this bureaucratic approach, I believe, did not apply to other countries. Often executions were done. So tell me what the differences and the similarities are in the persecutions, and are there maybe certain patterns that you can already see? But maybe you cannot answer this question yet. Maybe more research has to be done based on your work, but maybe you can already comment on this. Well, what one can definitely say is that depending on the regime, depending on the collaborative regime, and depending on the course of the war, and depending on the predisposition in the corresponding countries, persecutions happened in different ways. There were a number of factors. The brutality of the persecution depended upon. So the stereotype enemy has to be defined. In Bosnia-Herzegovina or in Crimea, Roma and Sinti were saved because the Muslim communities saved them. Didn't save all of them, but some of them, which is what we know from we do not know from the Catholic Church and the German Reich. And it heavily depends on the course of the war. So I have to use this word now, that this destructive war that Germany led in Eastern and Southern Europe, that brutal persecution occurred with executions on site. You maybe remember the Governor General map, that there was a combination of executions. So when Belzig, Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek, Kulmhof, these concentration camps, when they were working in 42 and 43, there was large-scale executions of the Sinti and Roma communities outside of the camps. So there are connections and developments which we have to scrutinize closely. I don't believe it'll be especially helpful to try to develop stereotypes or to derive schematics. I think what's more important is that we take a very good look, take a detailed look, and don't draw premature conclusions to say, oh, it's not this bad there, it's not this bad there. We are merely gathering the facts, and then we'll look at the bigger picture. Okay, thank you very much.